A title not seen since China's Cultural Revolution has emerged. The Communist Party's Central Committee dubbed leader Xi Jinping China's Helmsman. It's the same term used to describe former leader Mao Zedong. That's amid even more praise from state media. Another billionaire entrepreneur was arrested in China. He's the second in a matter of weeks. 7 disabled elderly people nearly jumped into a river to their deaths. That's after authorities took away their only means to make a living. The Five Eyes Alliance is criticizing China for its actions in Hong Kong, while China warned the 5 countries to be careful or they risk getting their eyes poked out. And Australia's Prime Minister tells China, "We will always be Australia." That's after Beijing complained about Australia's support of freedom in Hong Kong, Xinjiang and Taiwan, and about its decision to block Chinese companies from Australia's 5G network. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. First, we turn to Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. The CCP's media mouthpiece, Xinhua News Agency, published an article earlier this week praising Xi Jinping. The story called him the leader of the new era, as well as 7 more complimentary titles, including the core of the party formed in the Great Struggle, the commander-in-chief of reshaping the army and national defense, and the serviceman who seeks happiness for the people. The article comes after similar comments last month from the Communist Party's Central Committee, calling Xi the core leader and helmsman of the party. But it's not the first time the CCP has used the word helmsman to describe a party leader. Decades ago, former communist leader Mao Zedong was also dubbed helmsman. Mao ruled China for nearly 30 years until his death. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of Chinese people during political movements from the 1950s to the 70s. Jing Zhong, the former editor-in-chief of a Hong Kong pro-democracy magazine, told Voice of America the reappearance of the term helmsman is worth keeping an eye on. He said under Mao's leadership, China's so-called Red Guards, a paramilitary movement of students, beat about 2,000 people to death during the first month of the Cultural Revolution. That's referring to the social and political movement that reinforced communism in China and ousted much of traditional culture and ways of thinking. Since Xi came to power, he has strongly downplayed the history of the Cultural Revolution. The country's new history textbooks call the Cultural Revolution a hard exploration. Millions of people were killed or committed suicide during the 10-year political movement. Jing says he thinks Xi Jinping seeks to become Mao Zedong the second, pointing out that Xi abolished the party leader's tenure system and revised the constitution, likely for this purpose. He also established more than a dozen leading groups for committees under the CCP Central Committee, with himself as the head. The actions are widely regarded as a gathering of powers by Xi. Another billionaire entrepreneur in China has been arrested. It's the second time within recent weeks. On Tuesday, the former richest man in the mega city of Nanjing was arrested. His name is Yang Zhongyi. This after Sun Dawu, a known Chinese entrepreneur, was detained weeks ago for speeches criticizing the communist regime. His company was taken over by authorities, including its around 30 subsidiaries. But Yang's arrest stems from other reasons. The police notice states that Yang's Fuzhong Group illegally took in money from the public, using high interest rates as bait. The notice did not say whether Yang's company will be taken over by authorities. The company is an energy corporation. It mainly manufactures thermoelectric components. Since 2003, it was listed as one of China's top 500 private enterprises for 10 consecutive years. In 2017, the company brought in about $8 billion in total revenue. According to Japanese media company Nikkei, over the last 3 years, about 100 private companies in China have been nationalized by the regime. That number has increased from about 20 in 2018 to 30 in 2019 to more than 50 in 2020. The CCP's crackdown on private companies in recent years has had a huge impact. In 2010, the return of equity of listed companies in China was 13%, but only 7% remained in 2019. One tactic used to control private enterprises is investing capital. Some companies were taken advantage of when the business was hit by the pandemic, especially those with strategic importance, like semiconductor chip makers, wind power plants, and pharmaceutical companies. Authorities forced companies in these fields to accept state control. One example comes from SMIC, or Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, China's largest chip maker. More than 60% of its equity is now in the hands of a fund supported by Beijing. Even if the regime doesn't control a majority stake in the company, the capital backed by Beijing can still control the company if it has a large proportion of voting rights. And in the case that authorities are unable to take control of a company with these tactics, it still has other tools at its disposal. For example, with Ant Financial Group, Beijing will strengthen regulations that impact company operations or simply block its stock index listing plan. Now we turn to the fate of 7 disabled elderly people in China. They were recently spotted sitting at the edge of a river preparing to commit suicide. That's after Chinese authorities blocked their livelihoods and they were left with no way to make a living.
A video clip going viral this week online shows 7 disabled elderly people sat on the railings of a bridge, preparing to commit suicide. The 7 people are from the Ozhou city of Guangxi, an autonomous region in southern China. The tricycles that they depended on for their livelihood were taken away by officials, also known as chengguan. The old people had lost their way of making a living, which is what drove them to be there at the bridge. A Chinese citizen told us he is angry at the authorities. To protect his identity, we used his surname only.
Motorcycles, electric vehicles. The authorities said they violated regulations. It is too much to confiscate the tricycles. We've never heard that in Taiwan these vehicles are forbidden. Many people cannot survive in this society in China. It is very difficult, and many have jumped off the high-rise buildings for that reason.
Human rights activist Jinping became disabled in a car accident and has been fighting for the rights of disabled people in China for the last 2 decades.
These 7 disabled people were self-reliant. They made a living by driving tricycles. And how did the government treat them? I don't understand why their tricycles were confiscated, how the disabled are treated. If the rights of the disabled are safeguarded, this is one of the hallmarks of a civilized country.
On the same day, a video going viral showed a disabled person who visited the Hubei provincial office to petition because his subsidies had been taken away. But he was driven out. People from the office for petition told him, "You have to be obedient, otherwise all of your money will be deducted." Zhang experienced this himself. His subsidies were also stopped by officials just because he's been fighting for the rights of the disabled.
Severely disabled, first-degree disabled people with high paraplegia like me have 2 subsidies and 1 nursing care subsidy, but I have never enjoyed it because I said some truthful words that the government didn't like. If the government doesn't like it, it can deprive someone of these benefits at any time.
Reporting by Xiong NTD News.
Now we turn to Taiwan. Taiwan refused to renew the license of news channel CTI Cable on Wednesday, effectively shutting it down. The broadcaster is widely seen as pro-Beijing. The rejection decision was unanimous, citing accusations of interference in CTI's editorial independence by major shareholder Tsai Ing-ming. He's a Taiwanese businessman who runs one of China's largest food firms, Wantuan China Holdings. The cable station denounced the decision, saying press freedom in Taiwan is dead. Taiwan's government has repeatedly warned against the threat of communist Chinese influence, evident by Beijing's ramped-up efforts. That's including a media campaign to gain influence on the democratic self-ruled island. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing group is urging Beijing to reconsider its actions against Hong Kong's elected legislature.
Foreign ministers from Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and the U.S. said that the CCP's latest moves appear to be part of a campaign to silence critics. They called on Beijing to reverse course. It brought an angry response from the Chinese Communist Party. A spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, regardless of whether the Five Eye allegiance has 5 or 10 eyes, as long as they dare to harm China's sovereignty, security, and development interests, they should be careful that they will not get their eyes poked out. Hong Kong expelled 4 opposition lawmakers from its legislature last week after Beijing gave city authorities new powers to curb dissent.
And in the U.S., Congresswoman Debbie Lesko has introduced the Stop China's IP Theft Act. It aims to ban United States visas for those that pose threats to American intellectual property. The ban targets Chinese regime officials, active duty members of the Chinese military, and senior CCP members. That's including China's decision-making Politburo body, the party's Central Committee, and each delegate to the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as their family members. While introducing the bill, Lesko pointed out that China has a long history of stealing intellectual property. She explained that she hopes to send a message to Beijing that the U.S. will no longer tolerate intellectual property theft. The ban will remain in effect until it's certified. Other Western countries are also taking similar action. The Canadian Parliament passed a motion on Wednesday regarding Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei. It was introduced by Canada's opposition party. The motion demands that the Canadian government decide whether to ban Huawei from the country's 5G infrastructure within the next 30 days. Opposition party leader Erin O'Toole said it's time for the Canadian government to grow a spine. He added that Huawei's global success is due in part to years of industrial espionage. He asserted that decades of leniency towards China has not worked, saying that it's wrong to believe ignoring communism will make it go away, and adding that Canada must crack down on the CCP. Huawei is known to have close ties to the Chinese military. The U.S. has repeatedly warned that the company's technology may be used to spy on users, calling it a national security risk. At the same time, the U.S. is urging Canada and its allies to block Huawei from their 5G networks. China has repeatedly denied the claims. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau voted against the motion on Wednesday. He said the decision will be based on recommendations from Canada's intelligence agencies, but he did not say when it will be decided. At the same time, Canada also identified China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as cybersecurity threats on Wednesday. It's the first time the country has labeled them that way. The nation's Communication Security Establishment, or CSE, said that state-sponsored programs in these 4 countries pose the biggest strategic threat to Canada. In its second National Cyber Threat Assessment, the CSE stated that state-sponsored cyber activity is generally the most sophisticated threat. While in their first threat assessment, released 2 years ago, they mentioned foreign-based actors, but did not specifically name any country. China's foreign ministry claims that China itself is a victim of cyber attacks. It also continues to deny that Beijing has tried to break into other nations' infrastructures. Following the moves, Canada's Prime Minister also commented on China's style of diplomacy. Prime Minister Trudeau also on Thursday called Beijing's approach aggressive, adding that it's not constructive for either the world or Beijing's interests.
One of the things that we're pleased to see is there is an increasing working together of like-minded nations around the world who are concerned with China's more aggressive, coercive diplomacy, and trying to highlight that it's obviously not in our interests to see China be aggressive in all these different levels of consequences for trade deals and consequences for citizens. But we're also needing to push back on human rights, whether it's the concerns with the behaviors in Hong Kong or the situation of the Uyghurs.
Trudeau's remarks come ahead of Friday's APEC summit, a meeting of 21 country leaders from the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. The meeting will be hosted virtually in Malaysia. U.S. President Trump will attend, as well as Chinese Communist Party head Xi Jinping. Now we turn to Australia. Prime Minister Scott Morrison on Thursday pushed back against recent complaints from China, saying we will always be Australia. Tensions between the two countries arose this year when Australia called for an international investigation into the origins of the CCP virus. In response, China imposed several trade reprisals on Australian goods. The communist regime blamed Australia for going after what it called China's core interests and urged the country to correct its mistakes. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian on Tuesday read out a list of complaints, including Australia's remarks concerning freedoms and human rights in Hong Kong and China's Xinjiang region, as well as its support for Taiwan entering the World Health Organization. China also criticized Australia's actions against foreign interference, being the first country to ban Chinese companies from participating in its 5G network. Australia's Prime Minister Morrison responded in an interview with the 7 Network on Thursday. If this is the cause for tension in that relationship, then it would seem that the tension is that Australia is just being Australia. He added the accusation of China is nonsense. The latest response of China came on the same day. The same spokesman reiterated that the root cause for the deteriorating China-Australia relations is Australia's repeated wrong acts. Now we turn to the China-India border. The Indian Army has rejected China's claim that its forces used microwave weapons to defeat Indian soldiers. The British newspaper The Times quoted a Chinese professor saying the Chinese Army's microwave weapons drove Indian soldiers away from eastern Ladakh, a disputed territory between China and India. The Indian Army called the claims baseless and fake. The Times report was published on Tuesday and quoted Jing Chenrong, a professor of international relations at Beijing's Renmin University. Jing claimed that China had used a microwave weapon in late August to retake Indian-occupied land. The same story appeared in the online newspaper The Australian under the headline, China's microwave pulse weapon defeats Indian troops at Himalayan border, which is owned by the same corporation. India and China have been locked in a tense standoff at the line of actual control in Ladakh, and the tension has been going on for the last 6 months. 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a fierce clash in Galwan Valley on June 15th. The casualty of Chinese soldiers is yet unknown. Twitter has sent an apology letter to the Indian parliamentary panel. This after India accused Twitter of disrespecting its sovereignty and geotagging its northern Himalayan territory, Ladakh, as being in China. The mistake came to light after users tagged their post as being in Ladakh, but Twitter geotagged it as being in China, not India. Twitter stated that they are committed to protecting India's assets, both physically and digitally, and has assured the panel that the issue would be resolved by the end of the month. India's relations with China have been strained since the border war in 1962 and are locked in a military standoff over the disputed Himalayan border that includes the region of Ladakh. Several experts at a German parliament hearing on human rights in China described a worsening situation. They urged Germany to act. NTD's Germany correspondent Christian Watson has the story.
The conclusion of several experts who testified at a hearing this week at the German parliament is that dialogue with the Chinese regime has failed to improve human rights in China.
The effect of a pure human rights dialogue, which is otherwise linked to absolutely nothing, is virtually zero. We see a dramatic worsening of the human rights situation.
Whistleblower Cyril Saadbai spoke at the hearing. She was one of the first to testify on the human rights violations taking place in the detention camps in Xinjiang. She was imprisoned there in 2016. The State Department estimates the CCP holds more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim groups there without trial. Saadbai said in the camps she witnessed torture, killings, forced labor, and brainwashing. In March, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo awarded her the 2020 International Women of Courage Award. Adrian Zenz, known for her study on forced sterilization in Xinjiang, describes the goal of the CCP's repressive policies on minorities in Xinjiang, Tibet, and elsewhere.
A new kind of people is being molded that speaks Chinese, works hard, is obedient, and obeys the party. Fewer children, more modernity, no religion, no objection. The modern Uyghur is a model citizen.
And according to freelance journalist Leah Zhou, the persecution of the spiritual practice Falun Gong has also intensified this year. The deputy chairman of the Committee on Human Rights in German parliament says there is little hope of the CCP changing its ways.
The Chinese Communist Party shows no interest in changing for the better. The traditional Chinese culture is being destroyed by the Communist Party in every way. Marx was a German, Lenin a Russian. Marxism, Leninism is nothing but the rule of a foreign dictatorship, a foreign ideology.
Germany has conducted 16 so-called human rights dialogues with China over the years, the last one in September. According to Germany's Human Rights Commissioner, during these talks, the CCP is not willing to talk about concrete cases. And so, most experts at the hearing advocated for sanctions against individuals and companies involved with human rights violations in China. The European Union is working on a mechanism similar to the US Global Magnitsky Act. Germany is in support and wants to see it done by the end of the year. Reporting by Christian Watson, NTD News, Berlin.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.